As of March 26, 2026, the United States and Israel have been executing Operation Epic Fury for exactly 27 days. The inciting incident for this current regional crisis occurred on February 28th, when coalition strikes successfully assassinated Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In immediate retaliation, Iran mobilized its forces and launched mass drone and missile strikes at targets across the entire Gulf region. The rapid military escalation immediately hit the macroeconomic system. In under a month, the global price of oil has surged past $110 per barrel. The physical cause of this price shock is a severe logistical bottleneck. The Strait of Hormuz is now semi-closed, leaving roughly 2,000 commercial vessels stranded at sea, incurring an estimated $63 billion in economic losses across the Arab region. To halt the spiraling costs, the United States is currently attempting to mediate a 15-point ceasefire plan, delivering terms to Tehran via diplomatic channels in Pakistan. However, predictive intelligence models indicate this diplomatic track is superficial. Iran has already rejected the terms, issuing 5 counter-conditions. The peace process is structurally blocked by the conflicting goals of the nations involved. A negotiated trilateral peace agreement between the US, Israel, and Iran is mathematically impossible. To understand why diplomacy will fail, we have to evaluate the conflict through game theory, specifically looking for a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a stable state in a system where no single player has an incentive to deviate from their chosen strategy. If all parties are satisfied enough with their hand to stop playing, the war ends. Predictive modeling from the Center for Advanced Strategic and Predictive Intelligence, or CASPI, shows that no such equilibrium exists here. Instead, there is a 45% probability that this war devolves into a prolonged, frozen conflict, resembling a hybrid of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. This projection stands in stark contrast to the 1991 Gulf War. In that conflict, the US-led coalition maintained unified goals, achieved their defined objectives, and secured a clean military exit. Because no equilibrium exists in the 2026 theater, the current war will not end in a decisive victory or a clean defeat. It will transition into a prolonged state of structural exhaustion. We can map out exactly why a deal fails by looking at the specific strategic requirements of each player. The primary objective of the United States is securing a rapid political exit to avoid an overseas quagmire. The timeline for this exit is forced by intense domestic pressures. The administration is facing soaring domestic gas prices, widespread congressional dissatisfaction, and the massive financial cost of deploying the 82nd Airborne Division, all looming ahead of the 2028 midterms. Israel's objective requires the exact opposite of a rapid exit. Backed by a 93% public approval rating for the campaign, Israel requires nothing short of complete regime change and total nuclear dismantlement in Iran. This is an existential mandate. Israeli leadership perceives any surviving Iranian nuclear capability, even a frozen one, as a direct regime-ending threat to their own survival. Iran's baseline requirement for any resolution is pure survival as a functioning state. They intend to end the war on their own terms, demanding war reparations and sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. This need for total state survival is driven by extreme internal vulnerabilities. The Iranian regime is attempting to manage pre-war civilian protests, extensive infrastructure damage, and a massive leadership vacuum in the wake of Khamenei's death. The US requires an exit, Israel requires destruction, Iran requires survival. These 3 national goals are fundamentally contradictory, mathematically dooming any trilateral agreement before it even begins. This diagram shows the CASPI 3-player game theory payoff matrix. It is the primary mathematical tool used to evaluate the conflict's current strategic trajectory. The matrix scores the expected payoffs for each nation based on the actions they take, whether they choose to escalate, offer a ceasefire, or withdraw. A positive score denotes a gain, while a negative score denotes a massive strategic loss. Consider the hypothetical scenario where the US offers a ceasefire plan and Iran actually accepts the deal. In this cell, the US scores a +4 for achieving its rapid exit, and Iran scores a +2 for ensuring state survival. But look at Israel's score. Israel suffers a severe -3 payoff. If a bilateral deal is struck between Washington and Tehran, Iran's military capabilities remain intact, leaving Israel's existential threat entirely unresolved. Because of this unacceptable loss, Israel has a dominant strategy in the matrix. They must continue striking Iranian targets regardless of any diplomatic progress made by the United States. We already have historical validation for this behavior. When the Islamabad peace talks were first announced, the Israeli military ordered maximum strikes to physically disrupt the negotiations. There is a precise historical parallel for this coalition fracture: the Vietnam War in 1973. Israel is currently positioned exactly as South Vietnam was, an ally fighting for its literal survival, actively rejecting the negotiated terms of its patron because the existential stakes are too high to accept compromise. Because Israel rationally acts as an independent veto, any bilateral ceasefire agreement drafted between the U.S. and Iran is mathematically guaranteed to collapse. Based on that guaranteed collapse, predictive models outline a strict chronological timeline. In Phase 1, hitting in April 2026, the U.S. declares a superficial victory based on the Pakistan diplomatic framework. This brings temporary market relief. A 30-day pause on energy infrastructure strikes allows the Strait of Hormuz to partially reopen, dropping oil back to the $80 to $90 range. Phase 2 arrives in May and June, where the framework inevitably fractures. Because Israel is not a party to the U.S.-Iran deal, Israeli strikes continue unabated during the designated ceasefire period. These independent military strikes give Iran the legitimate diplomatic grounds required to abandon the paper ceasefire and selectively re-escalate the conflict. This forces the transition into Phase 3 by July 2026. The war mirrors the Korea 1953 template. The active fighting simply freezes in place without a formal peace treaty. Low-intensity persistence takes over. The U.S. begins drawing down its military forces, while Iran sets up a toll-charging system in a semi-open Strait of Hormuz to recoup economic losses. This messy, fractured hybrid scenario commands a 45% probability because it is the only path that accounts for all three players acting rationally on their incompatible goals, making it far, far more likely than either a clean diplomatic resolution or total Iranian capitulation. There is, however, an extreme outlier scenario. The model identifies a 3% tail risk probability where the situation bypasses a frozen stalemate and devolves into mutual regional destruction. The primary trigger for this catastrophic chain of events is a rogue strike. If an isolated faction of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's primary military force, strikes a major asset like a U.S. aircraft carrier, the math breaks down. Waves 1 and 2 of this scenario feature immediate, severe escalation. It triggers the rapid deployment of U.S. airborne troops into combat and forces Hezbollah, the heavily armed Lebanese Shia militant group, to enter a full-scale ground war. This outcome activates the nuclear wildcard. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, recently confirmed hidden highly enriched uranium inside Iran. A cornered IRGC faction facing regime collapse has a high probability of deploying a partial weapons capability. This chain reaction obliterates any chance of a frozen conflict. The external military pressure causes the Iranian government to collapse faster than anticipated, leading directly to a Libya-style scenario defined by decades of warlord fragmentation. This chart shows the single pivot variable capable of altering the model's math. A full ceasefire only becomes the most likely outcome if the United States applies extreme direct leverage on Israel. To be effective, Washington must strictly tie weapon shipments, intelligence sharing, and UN diplomatic cover directly to Israeli compliance. However, current signals indicate this leverage will not be utilized. The U.S. lacks the political mandate to completely restrain its closest ally. Because political incentives prevent the U.S. from restricting Israeli military operations, any diplomatic talks mediated in Pakistan will only ever generate temporary paper ceasefires. Looking to 2027 and beyond, the final strategic reality locks into place. The Islamic Republic survives in a diminished, isolated state, and its nuclear program is frozen rather than completely dismantled. The macroeconomic consequences are severe. With the Strait of Hormuz functioning as a heavily militarized, semi-closed toll route, global energy markets undergo permanent structural repricing. the regional military posture shifts entirely. Every neighboring Gulf state is now locked into a permanent elevated defense posture, draining resources to guard against sudden flare-ups from a wounded Iranian regime. The rational actors in this theater are bound by their incompatible objectives. They cannot agree to peace, and they cannot achieve total defeat. They will simply fight until exhaustion replaces victory.